I'm Harry Burkett, and thank you for joining us for Bob Dylan at 80. And if you like this podcast, then I hope you will join us for the Everly Brothers Forever. That's live at the Ocean Pines branch of the Worcester County Library on Thursday, February 17th at 2 p.m. Frank DeLucco and I will share the story of the Everly Brothers through music and video footage. Now on to our audio presentation. Hello, this is Harry Burkett with Frank DeLucco, and we're with the Ocean Pines branch of the Worcester County Library. And we are here to celebrate Bob Dylan at 80. Dylan celebrated his 80th birthday on May 24th of this year. We thought it was important to commemorate this milestone, along with Dylan's 60 years of music. We maintain that he isn't retro. He remains relevant today. He's an artist who keeps producing original work, keeps offering new interpretations of his work on stage. Today, primarily, we'll focus on 21st century Dylan. We maintain that it was 1997, just before the turn of the century, that Dylan gained just wide-ranging, bordering on complete acceptance. And his art was judged on its own merits and not compared to others. In other words, he became more or less the standard. Some of you may be familiar with us coming to the Ocean Pines Library. We've done programs on Dylan, and we've done programs on Buddy Holly and Ricky Nelson. And we plan to do a program on the Everly Brothers. It's just kind of loose, a good time. We play YouTube clips. We talk about their life stories, their careers, their impacts and influences. And we always have a pretty good turnout. So, Frank, what are your thoughts of Dylan at age 80?
Well, as Harry was reciting what previous presentations we have done, there is a theme. Those artists that we have done are all terrific in their own right, but they are tremendous influences on Bob Dylan. You think of him as being an influence on other people. The musicians and artists that we have covered are definitely influences on him. We're going to start our discussion, as Harry said, with 1997 with the release of Time Out of Mind. That came at a time where Dylan was at a low ebb that had started in the 80s and never really got going, except for a little hiccup there when he was with the Traveling Wilburys. But when he came out with this album, it was universally accepted.
And I should point out, Frank, that prior to that, his career was made up of what we call chapters,
Yes.
like definable phases. Just a quick rundown, especially if you're not familiar with Dylan. You've got your folk music, Bob Dylan, from the early 1960s when he was channeling Woody Guthrie, and Woody Guthrie was his mentor. Mid-1960s, that's when he transitioned to electric folk rock. That's probably the iconic Bob Dylan that everybody remembers. That's when he really revolutionized music in the mid-1960s. But that was a very brief period, 3 or 4 years. Late 1960s, he was on to country music. Mid-1970s, that was his second great phase, I would say. Blood on the Tracks, which was largely autobiographical. And, critics slap that up. They love autobiographical.
Yes. They always want to know more about Dylan, and he never, in any of his interviews, ever really released any kind of information about his personal life.
So that's why they gleaned so much from his songs. So in that same era, he did the famous Rolling Thunder Review. Early 1980s, he was going through his Christianity phase, became a born-again Christian. And like Frank alluded to, 1980s was more or less considered a creative drought from him. But, even today, critics are going back and have new appreciation for the 80s.
In fact, that's the latest bootleg is that the 1980s with Dylan. And looking back, now critics are saying, well, it really wasn't as bad as we thought it was.
Yeah, kind of like when they look back at the Eisenhower administration.
Yes.
Same kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true.
So Time Out of Mind that Frank mentions, if we had to give that a word, a phase, we could call it the mortality phase, because one reason the critics liked it is because this was the older Bob Dylan, worn down by time, looking back at his life, looking back at, I don't know.
Yeah, and he just had recovered from a very serious heart disease. And in fact, they thought he might die, but So we are, a lot of people think that album, Time Out of Mind, does show his flirtation with death. Like,
And it had more of a blues theme and very well produced. So the quality of the album was very good. Um, and now he had like some signature Dylan trademarks, such as 15-minute songs. There's one called Highlands. I talk about a lot with Frank because it seems like a song that kind of goes on and on forever, but it has very rich imagery in it. Um, but again, this is sort of like Blood on the Tracks. Blood on the Tracks, that was a lot about his talking about his deteriorating relationship with his wife. Um, this is autobiographical in the sense in 1997, him looking back, like the critics read into it, does Dylan have any regrets? I guess he's had a few, but just interesting, very
yes,
philosophical.
yes. But it started a renaissance for him, both musically and critically. That continued in 1990 or 2000. He did the song "Things Have Changed," which is a multi-level song title right there. But that was in the movie of
Michael Douglas.
Michael Douglas, and it won an Oscar for him.
That's
so
right.
that began a string that would culminate with in 2016 of he receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature. But in between,
Yeah. Love and Theft is one of my favorite albums. I just discovered it in a bargain bin at Ollie's, and I took it home. And I appreciate Dylan albums where I can understand every word, because that's a knock against Dylan. I keep going back to the 1995 album, World Gone Wrong, which I think was an album gone wrong, where he dusted off some old historic songs, but I couldn't understand anything that he said. But in Love and Theft, he had that gravelly voice that he's known for today, sort of like the balladeer, kind of gives you the image of a hobo riding the rails, which we were just talking yesterday. That's almost like his career coming full circle, because he was like the young hobo riding the rails when he first started out. So
now there was some controversy with that album. There was some complaints that he plagiarized, because he started in a way he kind of always did that, but it was very noted that a lot of fellow musicians and other critics said he was stealing music from previous other songwriters. That also, it didn't last long. The controversy, the album itself was terrific, and it began for him a this Americana, what they call it. So they have to give everybody some kind of label. So the folk rock, the country. We could probably say his 21st century is Americana, Dylan.
that's right. And he's won numerous Grammy Awards. He's been highly decorated since 1997. I think we have a short list of some of the honors he's had. There's the Kennedy Center honors in 1997. He was awarded by President Clinton. President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Dylan seemed to support Obama during the 2008 campaign, but then Dylan denied that, said he's never publicly supported a candidate. But that's typical Dylan, kind of going back and forth there.
Yeah.
And then, to me, the most interesting things that he's done in the 2000s are some commercials, which you think of Dylan as being someone who's not commercial, that he's an artist,
Right.
And he cannot be
Somewhat
commercialized,
recluse.
Because so many of his songs, especially the early ones, he criticizes materialism in kind of like yuppie culture or, that sort of thing. But he was in a Victoria's Secret commercial in 2004. He was in a commercial during the Super Bowl 2009.
Pepsi commercial.
He did a Chrysler 200 commercial during the Super Bowl in 2014, which had a decidedly protectionist tone.
Yes.
So whenever you think try to categorize Dylan as like a far left like war protester type. You can't categorize him that way because he's got many chapters in his life, and he doesn't like to be pigeonholed. And probably one of the most entertaining ones was he had a conversation with IBM supercomputer Watson in 2015. So it's always fun when Dylan, who doesn't really like mainstream publicity, rarely gives mainstream interviews, but he'll do these commercials. I wonder how many people actually recognize him below the age of 50.
Yeah, exactly.
um, so, Frank, did you want to talk about some of these other albums that he did in the early 2000s?
Yeah, we had the Modern Times,
Yeah.
which he won the Grammy Award for a folk Americana album. So again, you can see this when he's actually moving forward by going back into the past, pulling out music from, say, Appalachia and that kind of area, and mixing it into it. And he still has backing band on album and on his Never Ending tour. It is fantastic, and it's just widely accepted. Now, when he went 2009, he shared the writing duties with Robert Hunter. He is famous for working with the Grateful Dead, writing almost all of their lyrics. And that was still a very successful album. And something that we really just kind of picked up on in the last few days working up to this podcast was The Lost Notebooks of Hank Williams, something he put together that was released in 2011. And Dylan was like the executive producer, and then it included artists reinterpreting Hank Williams songs, including his son Jacob, Levon Helm, Norah Jones, Jack White, and others on this CD. So again, he's going back and reinterpreting it in new things. And Tempest included a tribute to John Lennon, who was a very good friend with John Lennon. And the title track is a 14-minute song about the Titanic, considered one of his darkest albums.
Wow. So, and we should mention did you mention the Frank Sinatra album yet?
No.
That was Fallen Angels.
Yes.
No, the first one was Shadows in the Night. Second one, Fallen Angels. Third one, Triplicate. I think even a lot of diehard Dylan fans who accept everything have difficulty accepting Dylan singing like Frank Sinatra. You know, he made an appearance on David Letterman. We were just talking before we recorded here.
Yeah.
He was dressed like a naval officer, and it just seemed very weird. But Letterman was a really big Dylan fan, and Dylan was among his first guests that he ever had, doing his talk show in the early 80s. And then he might have even been one of his final guests on the final episode. One pattern in Dylan's life is that
surprising you.
As soon as you start to appreciate what he's doing, he changes up what he's doing. And then fans have to make a decision. Do I get off the train or do I continue to follow?
Yes.
Yeah. And I would say one of those phases he lost a lot of fans was when he went through his Christianity phase. He might have gained a handful of fans, but like we said, even that's being looked at now and people appreciate that more. And then at the start of the pandemic, one of the very first artists to come out with some sort of release was Bob Dylan. It was, what was that called? The Kennedy Assassination.
Rough and Rowdy Ways.
Rough and Rowdy Ways was the album. Murder Most Foul. And that was 17 minutes of Dylan singing about the Kennedy assassination. Now, we know from his earlier work, going back to the early 60s, he was a big admirer of John F. Kennedy.
And that's not the first time he mentioned Kennedy in a song.
That's right. Now, my personal quibble with the song, it's a little graphic, talking about the actual assassination and the bullet and everything. He hits a lot of cultural notes in the song where he acknowledges the Beatles and the Eagles and other events.
Yeah, the blues artists.
Right. Now, we do suspect, they never really did tell us when that was recorded. but we suspected it might have been like 2013.
Yeah,
We can only gauge his voice.
his voice sounded of that earlier era. Now, for those that like the Sinatra episodes on the three albums, they say he kind of refined his voice, like kind of changed his voice and refined it, so he was able to use his voice more as an instrument than he has before, and they feel that's what helped him on the rough and rowdy ways handle the different types of songs.
And I think some of the critics who weren't Dylan specialists or Dylanologists
Right.
appreciated it more. I think we just saw Mick Jagger in a YouTube clip talking about Dylan's voice, where they think the weathered voice that he has now has character to it.
Yes.
Of a man who's traveled much and seen much. So one thing we go back and forth about, Frank, is Dylan overrated? Now, when I listen to some of his early songs, like Mr. Tambourine Man and Blowing in the Wind, and When Your Ship Comes In, especially the civil rights theme stuff, they really strike me as, wow, this is genius. I totally understand what he's getting at. I understand it. And no wonder he's covered time and time again. But then, especially during the electric folk era, a lot of it was pure nonsense. Like Bob Dylan's 115th Dream. That's one where he's singing about Captain Arab and he's on a ship. A Bigfoot comes through the line, and something about Crepe Suzette. It's just total nonsense.
Trying to interpret his songs has always been a challenge.
Now, it seems like in later years, they're not total nonsense, but he intentionally leaves them to very broad interpretation. And I guess that's his real genius. We're kind of painting that as a shortcoming, like we don't know what Dylan's talking about. But guess what? We wouldn't be talking about Dylan right now if we understood everything that he meant. So he's like a real life poet who intentionally leaves things vague, so it applies to a number of people, many people in many situations, and different phases of life.
They're always his songs have always been interpreted, and he never, when the press would ask him, what's this such and such song about? He said, you tell me what it's about. And that's exactly the way he has maintained. I mean, he's had a lot of ups and downs, but he's maintained that you interpret his songs. The listener interprets his songs.
And he's even said that it changes with time. Like a certain song he recorded in 1965 then meant something different then than if you sang it now. And we should point out that he's been on something that was called a never-ending tour since 1989?
1988.
1988. And
only the pandemic stopped it.
Right. That stopped him in his tracks. But prior to that, he had a remarkable number of dates per year that he was performing.
Yeah, I think it's like 150 dates, maybe even more.
Of course, there's people out there who keep track of his playlist and what he sings. And you have people, like people who follow the Grateful Dead, they follow Bob Dylan. They read a lot into the playlist. And they even think by the subtle changes to his playlist on a given night, it gives a whole new interpretation to his work.
Yes.
I don't know if I buy that, but a lot of people do.
A lot of people do. They consider that a plus. Right. Where we usually go into a concert, you want to hear the song that you heard on the record. But Dylan, I think he learned a lot from touring with the Grateful Dead that you don't have to do that. You can do your own interpretation, especially if your voice can't hit all those notes. And you can express it in a different way, and it still can be a very effective reading of his music.
Right. One thing we've learned about Dylan over the years, seemed like in his prime, you may remember those snide press conferences he would give, or the quotes you would read in Rolling Stone, where he seemed to have almost a condescending attitude toward his fans and also his contemporaries. But increasingly over time, like if you've listened to his old Thing Time Hour, is that what it's called? That was on Sirius XM on Deep Tracks. If you're not familiar with that, Dylan actually did a radio show
for 3 years.
where he would pick a theme. It could be flowers. It could be money. He actually came back and did one more episode just last year, I believe,
Yes.
to promote his Heaven's Door whiskey. And of course, the theme of that theme time hour was whiskey. So he would pick a theme and he would play music related to that theme of some of his favorite artists through the years. It could go back as far as back as the 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah.
So through that, you really realize what a student Dylan is of music and history. So he appreciates that. You kind of see those elements in his current songs in the 21st century. But his songs live on by the huge number of cover versions. I think he's got to set the all-time record for the most cover versions
Yes.
Of his work. And I forget what the documented number
And
is.
it's notable artists too, not just,
And I'll point out, he was even covered, in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, think of the Byrds that,
the Byrds took all those electric songs and made them more electric.
Peter, Paul, and Mary, but, one of my favorites, Elvis, even covered Bob Dylan. He did Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, which has been covered a lot. Waylon Jennings has an excellent version of that. Another one is Tomorrow Is a Long Time, which collected a little bit of dust until a documentary on Elvis Presley called The Searcher came out a couple years ago. And his version of Tomorrow Is a Long Time, which is Dylan's song, was the main theme of the whole documentary. So the fact that you had such heavy hitters back then recording him, and today Adele picked a song from Time Out of Mind called Make You Feel My Love, and she had a big hit with that.
And that song has been recorded by Garth Brooks, Billy Joel, among others. That's been probably his most covered song of this period that we're discussing today.
So I hope that gives you a sense of Dylan remaining very busy at 80 years old. He's still active, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention his Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016. Now, Dylan did not publicly accept the award, which was totally in keeping with his personality.
No surprise there.
But he cited other obligations. He insisted it was not a snub. He wrote them a nice letter, and he eventually submitted the obligatory paper with the committee in private at a later date. So isn't that the ultimate vindication or confirmation of his talent?
That he's a poet.
Absolutely. And I think it was controversy at the time, but I think looking back, it's not controversial now.
You look over his career, not at all.
That's right. And we were talking about the fact that he's not really criticized as much. And we kind of had a theory about that back in the 60s and 70s, contemporary critics who might have been just a little older than him, like Grill Marcus with Rolling Stone, if he did a great album, they called it genius. If he did an album that fell short, they blasted it. But now we're wondering, is it because the critics are younger today and they hold Dylan with such reverence because they know his history and his track record? But we're really hard pressed to find real criticism of his work since 1997.
Yes, it seems that he's just universally accepted. Whether it's there's only some maybe old critics that say, well, this could have been this, but by and large, he's at a point in his career where he is untouchable.
It's almost like he's being judged as an artist on his own merits, where he's not being compared to anything else because he has such a long, rich history with all of us that Dylan is just who he is. And he's the standard now. But I don't think there'll ever be another.
That's right.
And something tells us as soon as this pandemic lifts and some venues open up, Dylan will be very busy.
We'll be back on the road.
82, 83 years old. All right, Frank. Well, it's been fun talking about Bob Dylan, just chatting about our favorite guy here. So, all right. Well, hopefully we'll see you at the Everly Brothers.
We'll see you live.